Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's wonderful to see everyone at this important event for the Schwarzman College of Computing. My name is Asu Ozdaglar. I serve as the Deputy Dean of Academics for the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing, and I'm also the head of MIT's Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. I'm really delighted today to welcome you all to this very important and timely discussion of implications and also regulation of data and algorithms. And I'm delighted to discuss with our very distinguished panelists. So I'll just start maybe framing what the panel is about. Algorithms are, without question, impacting every aspect of our lives, whether it's in the context of social media, online commerce, automating tasks, and now a much wider range of creative interactions with the advent of generative AI tools, as well as large language models. There's little doubt that much more is to come. Today, every discussion I'm part of at MIT is governed by these kinds of questions. And of course, large language models such as ChatGPT have already been used within just a couple months time frame by hundreds of millions of people. And we're also hearing talks of sparks of general intelligence spreading. Whether these models really generate true intelligence or not, they are likely to transform many parts of our lives even further than the previous predictive type of AI technologies. And while the promise is evident to all of us, there's a lot to be concerned as well. And in the last few years, we've seen both the very positives as well as the negatives of the algorithms. They have amplified and propagated misinformation. They've intensified data collection and privacy concerns. They've contributed to automation and increasing inequality and deepened already existing biases. But they've also broken new ground in scientific discovery and diagnosis, social interactions and communication, and now really distilling this vast amount of information that we have and serving as decision aids. And all of these, of course, will be even further intensified with the generative models. And we would like to ask this question, I think, today of how can we understand what is to come and shape it so that we can improve the outcomes for the betterment of humanities. And we're hearing lots of proposals. They range from direct regulation of algorithms to reforming data ownership, as well as boundaries of freedom of speech online, all the way to breaking up large tech companies, and even to recently halting research in large language models or their applications. I think increasingly everybody recognizes new laws and regulations are necessary, yet so far, I think only few policy proposals have captured imagination of public and policymakers. So this is, I think, very much time for imaginative and thinking, careful deliberation to be able to improve the algorithms of tomorrow. So I'm very delighted. I hope I was able to convince you that these problems are critical, and I'm very delighted to discuss these critical and urgent issues with our very distinguished panel today. I'd like to start with brief introductions and maybe kindly ask each of our panelists to give a brief introduction of themselves. Maybe I'll go in alphabetical order. Start with Professor Srini Devadas.
Hi, I'm Srini Devadas. I'm a professor of computer science and, well, I guess electrical engineering and computer science at MIT. I've been here 35 years. I work on algorithms. I think I've worked on algorithms, since grad school, and I guess I'm, impressed but not blown away by what's going on in the field of AI, and I hope to share some of my thoughts with you.
Wonderful. So maybe next we go to John.
Sure. Hi, I'm John Horton. I'm an associate professor in the information technology group at MIT Sloan. I'm an economist by training, and most of my work is focused on online marketplaces and sort of how do we make them more efficient and fairer.
Wonderful. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Williams. I'm an associate professor of technology and urban planning here at MIT. I also direct the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. The Leventhal Center really combines architects, urban planners, landscape architects, media science to think about the advancements of our city. My own research focuses on using data and data analytics for policy change, and I recently published a book called Data for Action, Using Data for a Public Good.
Good morning. My name is Simon Johnson. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at MIT Sloan. I'm also head of the Global Economics and Management Group. I was previously chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, but I think none of the problems we're talking about today can be laid at my door, thank goodness. and I first came to MIT for graduates, for my PhD, studying for my PhD in 1985. I was 10. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks very much. So I'd like this to be, I think, interactive, but I'll just kick it off with some questions, and then also, toward the end, I also will welcome questions from the audience. So maybe we'll start with a few that I have thought about for our panel, and I'd like to start with data, because really data is the bread and butter of all of these algorithms and how they actually achieve all the personalization, personalized recommendations, feeds, and so on. So the question I think I'd like to start with is a fundamental one. Who really owns the data? And how do we share data? And what is the impact on user privacy? And I think importantly, how can we think about, if we think about regulation of data or changes in ownership, how would that affect the current landscape and the tech industry, and how all of these impacts are taking place? So anyone want to jump, or Srini?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a set of questions here, and they're all difficult. I think there's conceptual and gaps, there's semantic gaps, and there's operational issues. Conceptually, I think you struggle with the problem of, you put your data up on the web, and it's your pictures, and you attach your name to them. But you're not ready for all the correlations that, for example, advertising agencies are doing. You're not ready to kind of face the exposure that corresponds to, what you've put out, in a distributed sense, being collated together, and all the inferences that go on, and that's kind of what's changed really in the past few years. Semantically, what does it mean for privacy when you look at a language model or you look at a large neural network? They've used your data, perhaps it's private data, perhaps it's medical data. It's useful in creating the model. Do you have ownership of it? What is your exposure? And then, assuming you had these privacy definitions all worked out, if you had the regulations all lined up, how do you actually give people a privacy risk or give them a metric? So huge problems. I co-direct with Danny Weitzner what's called a Future of Data initiative at CSAIL that tries to address some of these problems and tries to connect policy and privacy technology.
Very good. And I actually, maybe a quick follow-up to that, Srini. With respect to technologies and regulations, how do you see these interacting, like privacy technologies, technological solutions?
Yeah, so I think that there's a little bit of a mismatch right now because you have regulations that are kind of technology agnostic, and then you have technologies that are obviously not technology agnostic, and they're actually quite difficult to understand, I think, even for experts. The notion of privacy, what's differential privacy actually mean? Is it useful in a regulatory context, et cetera? So Danny Weitzner is a lawyer. I guess I'm a technologist, and there's a collection of people who are looking into trying to, I wouldn't say marry the two because I think that's kind of that's far away. But at least find kind of a compatible intersection, if you will. And I think you have to look at very specific cases. You have to say, here's GDPR. Here's the regulations that are associated with medical data, for example, and then look at a particular technology and see if it satisfies these regulations. And this is a burgeoning area, I should say. So there's a lot of people working on it, including people who are are JDs and have PhDs in cryptography. I won't name names, but yep. So.
Sure. I mean, I think with a lot of this, it's probably useful to think about what's the end state you want. I mean, I think the notion of ownership of data, it's a legal construction. And, we've kind of normally thought of copyright as something that we set up to get the thing that we want policy-wise, which is, wide dissemination of information goods. And so, we'll give you some kind of time-limited monopoly on it to create the right incentives. So I think, it probably depends a lot on what particular data you're talking about, and do we feel that there's a risk of not creating the right policy incentives? And I think maybe a useful thing is to kind of go back through history. Every time we've had some new technological development that have kind of changed the construction of information goods, so photography, movies, recorded music, we've had to kind of rethink, well, how do we want to structure things to accomplish our goals? And so it's probably some combination of lawyers, economists, technologists, kind of figuring out, well, where do we want to get to?
I think data is the most important question, and I'm so glad you started with it, because I think it's the basis for all of these models. And I think one thing that I talk about with my students is really, the data's journey, how the data got created, how it got formulated to begin with, the questions that were asked of people, who is in that data set, really affects the outcome of any of our models. And I think that one thing that we don't fully understand about a lot of the models that we're working with is that data's journey. How did that data get incorporated? Who's represented, who's not? And how does that journey of the data into the model affect our the ultimate answers, right? And I think one thing that, I know you were wanting to talk about privacy, but I think also that all of the biases inherent in the data that are trained on the model, I think, is still very unclear. When, before, when the models were very discrete and they had kind of a discrete data sets that were being trained, when we're looking at medical work, right? You knew kind of who was in that data set, where it was coming from. Now we have kind of a new scenario where we're learning new things, but we're not exactly sure the provenance of that data. And I think that's where work really needs to happen. And as you say, just like, a pen on a paper or photography, or, the algorithm holds the biases of the person who creates it, as well as the data in which it's created with. And I think those are where we need to start really doing more research and thinking about those potential outcomes. I think we've seen a lot from training data sets on facial recognition already, and we already know that happens a lot when we type something into Google, and the kinds of results we get are heavily biased or heavily gender biased. We need to also be doing that kind of work and understanding that with data. But I think we have, technology always progresses faster than regulation, right? And so part of that's the case. And so I think it's up to us and all of us who are working with these models and working with this data to really start researching in this area in order to create the proper kind of regulation and guardrails that are needed. Because as we kind of progress, we're asking policymakers to catch up with us, and so it's up to us to think about our own ethical solutions to these problems. And I think just as important as to progress with the technology, we need to really start a field of looking at these questions. What biases are in the algorithm? What biases are in the data or in that data's journey?
So in every major technological transformation of at least the past 1,000 years, Asu, probably longer, there's always been an element of taking something that was previously common property, it didn't have a market value, it was somewhat shared among people, and turning that into private property and putting a monetary value on it and then trading it, or forcing people to acquiesce to a new system of property rights. And I don't think data is the new oil. I think it's oil, railways, and finance all rolled together. Right? It's central to everything that we do and are going to do going forward. And it absolutely does involve transfer of things that we've created and we've put out freely and wanted to share. That was sort of the basic loose philosophy behind the internet. Those have been turned into something valuable, something monetized. And I think also, as we're going to explore in this panel, it is going to lead to an unprecedented concentration of wealth, power, and corporate profits, all of which is somewhat foreseeable, and we can put in place, notwithstanding Sarah's very important point, that regulation falls behind, but we do know how to get ahead of this one, and we do know what system to build, social system. Will we build it is the question.
I mean, these are all excellent comments. And in terms of regulation, we have been thinking about it, right? We've seen the GDPR, as mentioned before. So I think policymakers are trying to make sense of this. And, you know, it's hard to get ahead of this very fast-paced technology. But still, there's some attempts. And I mean, just quickly, maybe in your view, has that worked? Like, was GDPR in any way, did it make a difference? Or what other things one should be thinking about? And in doing so, would it have any impact on you know, the tech sector?
I think that GDPR largely bounced off the tech sector, for obvious reasons. I mean, you're looking for a balance between innovation, regulation, responsible action. and if you put sufficient restrictions on domestic innovation so that people are afraid to take the risk or they go take the risk somewhere else, that's not exactly going to help anything move forward. And I think if we look at who the players are, I'm talking about concentration of power, this is between the US and China right now, as far as we can see. I mean, I put this to some leading European economists on Saturday night, and their response was absolute silence. So where is the European industrial policy, private sector, AI development? And if anyone in the room has counterexamples, I'd be delighted to hear them. But I think we're looking at extreme concentration of geopolitical power, something that Dan has written about, I think eloquently as well, flagged very clearly in his book, with a number of other famous people. Dan's book with Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
So I agree with Simon that GDPR's bounced off the big tech players. They are affected by it in the sense that I think they have to react to it. You know, there are obviously a possibility of lawsuits from individuals and so on and so forth. But if you take the private advertising space, you know, it's really a place that's very invasive in terms of individual privacy. You know, all you have to do is make one click, and you know, days later you're seeing these ads, and you realize why. You know, after you see them for the fifth time. One of the things that I think is important to point out is that the incentives don't line up. The tech companies, the ones that make money off advertising, they don't really want to solve the private advertising problem because if it cuts into their bottom line. And unfortunately in this space, I think, and many other cases as well, there is a conflict between user privacy and utility. And utility, you know, it translates to money. The conversion, you know, of a click into a purchase, you know, is utility in this case, and that translates to money. And the moment there's a conflict, essentially what the tech companies are doing, and this is how they're affected, I think, partly by GDPR, is how do we, you know, kind of pretend to care about user privacy while keeping our utility maximum, right? So.
Very good, very good. I'd like to, I guess, move from data to algorithms a little bit, what Sarah was mentioning. So, Sarah, you mentioned design of algorithms to avoid biases is critical. How do we actually do that? How can we, what should be the forefront considerations in designing algorithms so they lead to good recommendations? And how does it depend on the bias in the data?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is very hard. I mean, this is a question we've been thinking about since we really started kind of working with data. And I think one way that we can really check some of our biases is really kind of doing some of the data validation, right? So kind of consistent tests about how the outcome of the algorithm is operating. I also think that bias in some ways is unavoidable. Like we all bring our, let's say, perspective to bear. And I think, you know, kind of having kind of an ethical check is really important in companies that are developing these algorithms. And how do we do that? It's by looking at things through multiple perspectives and multiple lenses, right? So the outcome of a particular algorithm from the perspective of a gender lens, through a perspective of kind of monetary lens, a perspective of governmental lens. How are those outcomes different? I think one way that we can start to kind of understand the bias, but I also think the kind of bias with large language models is that we often don't know what they're being trained on specifically, and I think to me, that has a big issue because you don't know the bias is inherent in the kind of core of the data set itself. So I think we really need to start there and kind of thinking about where the biases are.
I don't know if anyone else wants to jump.
Well, I think that the good news in this discussion is we're focused on bias and thinking about alternative ways to measure bias and to approach bias. And you actually have some machine-led versions and some human-led versions. Isn't there can't we find combinations where instead of, I think there's a fixation, Asu, with, if I may say in your field, with machine intelligence and trying to replace people with machines. And I think if I can take the liberty of interpreting what Sarah says, is why don't we look for ways machines can be useful to humans and help humans recognize their bias and reduce their bias, so the machine is complementing the human approach, not trying to displace or replace the humans.
I want to
We have to say something. What do
Yeah,
you think from our side?
I want to say that I really don't want to conflate algorithms and data. I think the machine learning algorithms that are out there today, they're not that complicated, right? They work on a huge amount of data. It's unclear where the data came from. It's unclear what the biases in the data are. The algorithm itself is, I don't know if it's a few lines of code. I mean, obviously, in order to make it performant, it's millions of lines of code, but it's not a complicated algorithm. So, it's interpolating, it's extrapolating, it's summarizing. So I think it's relatively easy. I mean, I don't think it's happened yet, but I think relatively speaking, it's an easier problem to talk about inherent biases in algorithms, especially things that aren't that complicated. Now, I think the data problem, as I think Sarah talked about just now, I don't know how to get a handle on that. I'm not a data guy, I'm an algorithms guy, and that's probably partly why. And there's a huge amount of data, right? If you look at language models, 570 gigabytes of data that went into GPT-3, I think, and 175 billion parameters. So there's a lot there. And explaining what the algorithm did, because you have no idea what the data was, is, I think, basically the problem.
Yeah,
right?
That's exactly what I was trying to say. It starts with the data, right? I mean, that is the foundation for all of it. And without a clear understanding of what's in the data, how it's created, how it's formed, we can't understand the biases in it. Like, who's missing? I think that's the biggest thing for me. Who's missing in the data, or what's missing in the data? I think what's missing is actually a lot more telling than what's actually there, even.
It's very good. Very good. I guess I would like to move on a little bit to large language models and then maybe relate some of the things we're talking about in that context, because human augmentation or the dependence on data is even more intensified in the context of LLMs. Everybody's talking about generative models, language models. Are these game changers? Where can we use them most beneficially? And then also, there are, I think Simon started sort of alluding to it, there are also concerns about, how can we make sure we develop these phenomenal technologies so that they're actually, benefit humans and, they're developed in a way that sort of helps human flourishing. So how can we make sure, this is accomplished while we're thinking about their development?
Can I make just something about large language models, kind of drawing back the previous discussion?
Please.
I think one of the challenges of even talking about bias with large language models is how malleable they are to prompting. So you could say, make this decision, and it will give you some answer. Or you could say, make this decision as a libertarian, or a Democrat, or a woman, and so it's really not, it's almost the idea of calling it biased. It doesn't, it's more, you can kind of make it what you want it to be on the fly. And I think that it's kind of ultimately up to the end users what they do with it. But I do think it makes the kind of how we think about them more challenging, that they are not just a simple prediction, some classifier that we can kind of put in a lab and look at what it does. In the wild, they can kind of do some
Wild things.
crazy things.
Yeah.
Let the computer scientists go first, then I'll criticize them.
Well, I mean, I have to say that they really surprise you sometimes with their quote unquote creativity, and I keep going back to this thing. It had its data. The data was all out there. The data isn't intelligent. The algorithm isn't that complicated. How did it come up with this, right? So, and that's the amazing thing. And maybe it's because of computation, power, or it's just that creativity is interpolation and extrapolation and summarization. And if you put all of those things together, there's a synthesis here that really surprises you. And I think there's been lots of articles about how creative these outputs look. And also how stupid they are, right? The thing is that it's a lossy compression. When you summarize, and so it makes some egregious mistakes, right? It's just like I'm super annoyed that this paper that's my personally highest cited paper that I asked about didn't have me listed as a co-author, right? It was just like, come on, how can you do this, right? And this is just a lookup. Right? I mean, why is it doing this when it's just a lookup? Google search would never get that wrong. But so now you're going to, you're moving to, let's do semantic search, and you're getting creativity out of it, and you're getting lots of mistakes. But maybe that's, maybe they go hand in hand, right? So.
Simon, you want to?
I mean, one of the things that I think is just interesting is that OpenAI obviously kind of kicked off this recent enthusiasm. And, you look at how people use it and you think, well, it's hallucinating, it's making things up. That's just sort of the nature of this kind of model. People should understand this. And then you see your students using it and they like, oh, okay, so-and-so wrote this paper. And, they definitely want to treat it like a search engine. And I think it's partially OpenAI. They built one thing and made it look like another. Right? Like they made a mini fridge, but they kind of made it look like a toaster. And people want to use it as a toaster, but that's really not what it does. So I think there's probably just part of it is us getting used to this new technology. Like, well, you really can't trust it. It's going to make things up, but then what you need to do is sort of either fact check it or combine it with your own editorial judgment or sort of have some prudence about like this is the kind of task that it's good for and that's not. And it's only been a few months, right? And we're kind of figuring that out as we go.
I mean, really quick, I think you can trust it less than search.
Absolutely.
You can trust it less than Google search. I mean, Google search at least will give you the contradictions. This is going to give you an answer that's 80% correct, right? And you don't know which 20% is wrong.
I mean, I think it's partially having like a meta knowledge. Like, is this the kind? Like, if say I'm asking it, come up with an agenda for a meeting for me. Like, I'm kind of the arbiter of whether or not that's good enough for my purposes. There's no factual kind of like, well, I need to go Google the actual meeting. Like, no, it's just generative, and then I can kind of apply my judgment. So those kind of tasks, it seems perfectly suited. It's these other tasks that are maybe some combination of like factual knowledge that, it looks factual, but is clearly not. And I think we're not used to dealing with a system like that yet.
Very good.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of the biggest issue, and even I would say it's a kind of new literacy that we need to create. I mean, I often talk about data literacy. If we use these tools, data and governance all the time. Even teaching data literacy for policymakers, regulation is very important. But a literacy around open AI, I think, is extremely important and something that will allow us to use it for good because we can have these kind of conversations. I think, one of the things that I've seen my students or people in my research lab using it the most is like, asking it questions, throwing it off ideas, riffing on things, and then you can check that, the information that you're getting back, not thinking of it as kind of validated when it comes back at you, but using it kind of as a creativity tool in a way to get your ideas started. But I think that does take a recognition of the fact that it's not going to be accurate, or it's 80% accurate. And that kind of recognition is not out there yet. I think it's here for sure, but how do we get that message? And if it's open to the public, how do we create different data literacy classes, so that kind of people who, my concern is that the kind of amount of misinformation in the world that exists right now is extremely problematic to our political and economic systems, and that without some kind of data literacy or kind of AI literacy, the misinformation problem is going to grow exponentially.
So I think the one point I'd like to overlay here, which I think my fellow panelists know very well, but it's so obvious to them they didn't emphasize it, is the speed of this change, Asu. So I wrote a book that's coming out shortly with Doron Asamoglu called Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. It's such an important book, it's got its own chair on this panel. And we finished the draft of the book last summer. We showed it to some of our friends. So it's sort of the 1,000-year backstory of technological transformations leading up to, we thought generative AI may be coming in some form. We were slightly disparaging about its capabilities when we finished the first draft. A number of our colleagues in the industry said, love the book, but you might want to ratchet up a little bit, what this thing can do. And then we showed them another draft. It was almost ready to go to press in November. They're like, you know what? You need to turn it up a little bit more because this thing, ChatGPT, is just about to be released. Now, I've been using the number of 100 million people training ChatGPT. You just said hundreds of millions. I got to go update my numbers, Asu, because I think it probably is hundreds of millions. I'm probably using stale data, right? And as I said, I mentioned, I was talking about the job implications of this, which are profound. They're everywhere, immediately, in the world. We can talk about specific countries. I was talking about this to this group of economists who cover the world and work around the world. On Saturday, last week was IMF meetings week in Washington, D.C., so you have all the fish in one barrel. And first of all, they said, yeah, absolutely profound effects, we're seeing it, and we talked about it. And then they told me about how, and they're like, yeah, we're very concerned. And then they talked about how they and their family and their kids are training these models in their spare time for free to make them better or play with or build whatever. Right? So I think this is a process that is massively beyond the control of us, but it's not a process that we should just sit back and let it go, because I think we're going to really regret some of the outcomes. So we need to get ahead of it while recognizing key points, including what Sarah said, that regulation of the standard historical kind always falls behind.
So I mean, I'd like to build on this. Like, is this so different that this needs very different kinds of what kinds of regulations would this have? And in terms of, should there be regulations on how these technologies are developed, how they're used? And in that context, for instance, we've seen recently the, request for pause or, moratorium for research on these technologies. So what is the right way to approach this?
So maybe I can offer a framing, and my colleagues can criticize me this round. So if you think about railways, oil, and finance, which are three massive transformations we've experienced in the last 150 years. So railways, we responded to with a lot of very detailed, specific regulation, some anti-monopoly measures. Oil, we broke up. Standard Oil was broken up. And finance, bizarre story. Finance, we ended up providing an enormous backstop so they can do whatever we want and we bail them out. Right? It's a weird thing. Okay, we do put some regulation on there, but that really doesn't work. I don't think any of those approaches, Asu, are going to get political traction in the time frame available. I mean, we could argue about the merits of it, but this is coming so fast, it's going to change so many things, and the political process is very slow. Regulators struggle with 20-year-old technology, let alone the things that we're talking about here. And I think the key thing the key danger I would focus on is not just the incipient or emerging or actual market power, but also what you might call the monopoly power of business models. The big companies, and there's only a couple of them, that are emphasizing replacing humans. And it's a lot about machine intelligence as opposed to the machine usefulness that I'm sure many researchers are thinking about. And I think that the best way to combat that is with a graduated corporate tax system, where you're taxed according to how much profit you make. Because as you know, what we got from the internet was concentration, market power, platforms, and huge profits that are largely untaxed. We have a graduated corporate tax system in the US right now, but it's graduated the wrong way. Big companies pay very little tax because they hide their tax in offshore in various ways. If you flip it around, Asu, and you tax bigness, big profits, you're giving these companies a substantial disincentive to break themselves up and to find ways to create shareholder value, reduce their tax burden on the shareholders, that's who it falls on, by making themselves smaller. We need plurality of business models. We need a wide variety of innovation. What we're getting is extremely concentrated, way too focused on replacing people. This is destroying jobs around the world as we speak at lightning speed. We really have to get ahead of this. Corporate tax.
I was going to say, how are you going to regulate this? I mean, it's open source algorithms. The stuff's out there, right? You know, the cat's left the bag, cat's out of the bag, horse left the barn, whatever. It's just out there. I mean, the data is public. You can do what you want with them. You know, you got your own compute. You're a private organization. The closest to me to regulating this was encryption. Encryption standards regulated, by the United States in the 90s, where you couldn't put out 40-bit, more than 40-bit encryption algorithms out there. That didn't even make any sense. I mean, the algorithm was parameterizable, right? So you could always run a bigger key to it. So this is way beyond that, right? So the regulation ain't going to do squat.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree. I agree with that. I agree with that. But I don't think the answer is to give up. I think when and if you turn the data into something that's useful and something you can monetize, you make a profit and you pay tax on that profit. That is a key foundation of our economic system. Okay, maybe Donald Trump doesn't pay tax on his profit, but everyone else does. Okay, and that can be effectively a form of regulation because I'm giving you a disincentive to own the entire world because I'm going to tax you at a much higher rate for the entire world. If you break yourself up into 10 pieces, lower tax rate, your shareholders are going to be happy.
I mean, if liability gets into the picture here, then I think, then the engine might, break down, all right? So that's also the danger.
We can stop. Look, we can always stop anything we want, but it doesn't mean our competitors stop. That's one of Dan's big points in Dan's book, right? What are our competitors going to do? And aren't there good things we can get with the right people, like you, in charge, as opposed to just pursuing this monopolization, basically, of information, which is what the default setting is right now.
Good. Any other thoughts?
I mean, I think if I had to kind of characterize what this technology might do, I mean, it seems to potentially having an anti-monopolization type impetus. I mean, Google's sort of stronghold on sponsored search. I think people, if you had said 3 years ago, how's Google's position? People would have said, oh, they're rock solid. I think for the first time in a long time, people are kind of saying, well, this might really change this paradigm. Is like the Google search model sort of the way things go? And you look right now, there's just kind of this explosion of startups trying to work out what are the technical implications, like what are the things you can do with this technology now. So I think, if I had to make a prediction, I think we're kind of going through a phase of enormous sort of shakeup. And I think that that's a good thing. I think there is something to be said for having a plurality of lots of companies pursuing things, and monopolies are generally bad. But I think, to Simon's point, I think focusing on the levers that we can actually pull from a public policy standpoint, things like tax and sort of how we treat intellectual property, that's a lot more feasible than saying like, okay, well, pause regulation. I mean, how do you even, pause research. How do you even do that? You're talking about maybe some kind of voluntary agreement that no one is actually going to abide by. It kind of seemed very ill-conceived and unrealistic right from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think though I agree with the kind of tax logic, but I also think, like when you look at how technology gets used in cities, I think it's a great example of like the potential harm of this, right? Like if we think about Uber totally transformed the economics of like taxis, right, in a second. And cities were excited to invite Uber in to cities, not thinking about the fact that it was going to kind of devalue their whole taxi system. I mean, this is like more of a simple solution, right? But like totally change the economy of taxis, which maybe needed to be changed, but the inequity that was driven from kind of the interest of getting Uber in and not being thoughtful about the potential job loss or other kinds of issues that would come to bear, I think was something that we think about over and over again in city government. And I would say especially in African continent where I do a lot of work, in kind of Uber coming in caused huge economic problems in terms of how taxis operated, how transport operated in the city. And I think we're not even thinking about those kind of small things that are happening. I think tax is an important way to kind of slow it down, but also do cities or local governments have the ability to say, wait, we're not going to use this technology in any kind of person who's working in government yet until we've worked out the potential inequities with it. So I think, in this case, we're not saying, we're not sure what the regulation is yet, but what the regulation is, wait, we have to stop. What is the effect on kind of the economy of this city? Should we allow X to be used within this type of city service? And I think that kind of analysis needs to be done because I do think you see it again and again with technology investment in cities. I'm talking about cities because I'm an urban planner, but I could see it, and again, we kind of bring technology in and it creates huge inequities, which then the tax base doesn't allow us to recover from, right? In that we have people who don't have jobs, people who can't find work, don't have housing, and so forth. So I think kind of at the least at that level, we can say, let's create a pause on using it within government in order to figure out how it might affect government systems.
Look, Sarah's points are very important and entirely valid, but let's focus on the political economy here, right? How did Uber do what they did? How did railways spread, right? It was the same. There were many leading medical professionals in the 1820s who thought if you traveled at more than 30 miles an hour, your head would fall off or something like that, right? But what happened was you couldn't stop all the railways in all the places. It was a local strategy. Let's connect Manchester and Liverpool and make some money, right? Let's bring Uber to the city, and you know what? The consumers like it because the taxis are awfully annoying. I'm just talking about Boston here, right? So that strategy, and I think particularly when there's a local bottom-up piece to it, that's very hard to prevent or to stop. The two things that have enabled more benefits and more sharing of the benefits in these previous technological revolutions are some form of countervailing power, right? Because you're building big business. Who are you setting up to counter that? Is it a regulator? Well, I think we have our reservations. What other levers do you have, as John said? And the other thing is you need public investment. You can say the investments in education. You can say the investments in jobs. How are you going to take this additional potential productivity and convert that into something other than extra high profits and wealth for a few shareholders? That's the key question. I think that's where we have to come into this, Sarah. And I think we have to recognize these companies, the big companies are very powerful. The innovators who we love the entrepreneurship, we love the plurality, they're also very powerful. They're also doing all kinds of crazy stuff that people are going to like. Right? I don't think you can stop them, and I think we need to figure out where the flow is going and channel that flow and develop the countervailing power through taxation, and then put that into the public investments that people like yourselves identify.
Exactly. I mean, we invited Uber in because it's much more convenient than taxis, but we didn't ask. They are operating on the public roadway. They don't help contribute to that public roadway through taxes or other contributions. And so I think that's kind of what I'm talking about, like in taking a pause, right? Like, how do we make sure this kind of investment has another investment into the social lives of everyone, right? So if we're going to bring people in, how does that tax then go to housing? Tax go to other
impose things? Congestion charges and then rebate the charges for whatever the preferred means of transportation is that you want to encourage. So that use the tax system as a form of de facto regulation. It has real bite and real power, and it can keep up with the technology.
Excellent. This is great, and I can continue with my questions for another 4 hours, but I want to make sure others also have a chance maybe to ask questions to our panel. So Dimitris.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the nice, exciting remarks. something that has been worrying me for a long time is this acceleration of these new models have created potentially the opportunity of creating intelligence above humans. We are, I have been following the recent developments in the last few months, and boy, we have been at the very least, the curve has gone up. So there are many serious circles of people I respect who think that if this continues, this could be a threat to the human race as extinction. In fact, I quote Jeff Hinton. I read the interview he gave on the question about the possibility of human extinction because of this acceleration of these models and the capability they have. He said, I quote, "It's not inconceivable." He was talking, of course, to a very large public audience. He has to be careful. But and then there's recent signings of scientists about deaccelerating the progress, about creating systems that are better than GPT-4, for example. So I'm curious. This is a first-order issue. It's not a. We can talk about bias. The other is talk about extinction. So, what do you where do you stand on this? What is your view, and what should humanity do about it?
Yeah. Well, I think we haven't talked about safety, and we've talked a little bit about incompetence, I think. So the danger here in terms of human extinction is, maybe it's super intelligent, whatever, but you have incompetent intelligence, or things, you have a system that you think is intelligent, but it makes mistakes, right? That's the danger. So I think what has to happen, I'm a technologist, I think this gets fixed. It's a technological problem. Safety in terms of what the predictions are, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're going to use this, you better fix it, right? Autonomous vehicles were promised to us, 2019? We aren't there yet, and the reason is safety. So that's good. That's there. I guess the regulations helped in terms of not letting these crazy drivers on the street, right? But I think that's, to me, the biggest challenge with machine learning is how do you get the 6 nines of reliability, right? Right now, we're talking about 80%, 90%, what have you. Alexa, didn't get much better, right? So if you're going to use this, you better get your safety story right.
I think, given how bad the end state would be that people are discussing, it's worth kind of thinking about it and taking it seriously. I think one of the things you struggle with is sort of the people who take a very, very pessimistic scenario. When you try to press them on what are actual sort of the paths, like what are the threats, like war game this out for us, you get a lot of kind of like hand-wavy arguments and like a reference to a dense 100-page thing that's not really that comprehensible. So I think it is something we should take seriously, and I think I would love to see a lot more concreteness about it, not sort of hand-wavy, imagine a godlike superintelligence and you'll just be an ant and, you won't be able to do anything. I'd kind of like to know, like, what exactly do you see the threats are? Is it nuclear weapons? Is it biological agents? Is it, swarms of robots? I think that anything starts sounding like a Terminator script when you start talking about this. But, I'd like to see a lot more research and concreteness about what do we think the threats are, and then are there things that we can do to make sure that that's not the end state that we end up in?
I think we need to focus on the bigger threat of really extreme changes in economics, of jobs, and that the inequity that there's potential to create before we get into human extinction, because I do think these questions about taking jobs or kind of, it's just I think it's a shift in our economy that's massive and happening very quickly, and that's something that needs to be seriously considered before we start thinking about human extinction.
I think Dimitri raises a very important point, and we shouldn't dismiss it. It's on the list, right? Dimitri is probabilistically in terms of potential causes of our extinction. I don't know if it's in the top 5 or the top 10, but it's definitely there. And I think it's, and if we think about other episodes in which we've allowed technology to get ahead of our common ability to control it, World War I comes to my mind, 20 million people dead one way or another, in part because of the way we developed and used machines and thought about technology like poison gas, for example. So allowing the machines to get ahead of our common sense or culture, civic culture, is super dangerous and important. And what I worry about mostly, though, Dimitri, would be the monopolization. Having 1 or 2 companies control this, drive it in a particular way. And then I come back to Sarah's point, which is before we get to extension things, I think we lose a massive number of jobs. We can see those jobs being lost right now around the world. We can talk to people we know, talk to somebody you know in other countries about the jobs that are no longer there today. They've already been automated away by ChatGPT. And then ask them, okay, where are the new jobs? Or as economists like to talk about, where are the new tasks? What are the new things people are doing? And who is doing that and how much are they being paid? And that's, I think, the short-term massive imbalance, Dimitri, that is coming at us right now. And then we'll get to extinction.
I'm getting my note about we need to wrap up. Thank you so much, Srini, John, Sarah, and Simon for the fascinating conversation. And I'd like to thank everyone for their participation. These are such important issues. I very much look forward to continuing this discussion with everyone. And hopefully we'll be hearing from many of our speakers today on these questions. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.